So we're going to start off today with a little background information on Ezra. Just go through a fun-filled 10-point list, giving you some pros and cons into his past. Number 1, he obtained degrees in commerce and law from the universities of Calgary and Alberta, respectively. 2, he worked for the Fraser Institute. Number 3, he had advocated the abolishment of trade unions, minimum wage, universal health care, subsidized tuition, and public pension plans. Number 4, supported Quebec's, then Alberta's, separation from Canada. Number 5, he's admitted liability for defamation. Number 6, was disciplined by the Law Society of Alberta for violating various rules of professional conduct. Number 7, Levant, along with Sun Media, was threatened with a libel suit after accusing George Soros of being a Nazi collaborator as a child. This statement was retracted and an apology was issued. Quote, Sun Media, this newspaper, and Ezra Levant retract the statements made in the column and unreservedly apologize to Mr. Soros for the distress and harm this column may have caused him. Number 8, has spent time as a tobacco lobbyist. Number 9, he's been featured on Glenn Beck's show on CNN. There, Levant supported the Canadian government's decision to refuse George Galloway's entry into Canada in March of 2009. Free speech advocates protested this move, citing it as a hypocritical double standard. Number 10, in March of 2010, Levant accompanied U.S. conservative personality Anne Coulter on a Canadian speaking tour. Her speech at the University of Ottawa was cancelled at the last minute, apparently by its organizers, because of what Levant called physical danger to Couture and the audience from the protesters. The Ottawa police later disputed any claims of violence or unrest. So there you go, those are 10 points. You can take them or leave them for whatever they're worth. Like I said, some good, some bad. Alright, let's get started with episode 2.
Why am I sweating even more than normally? What is that awful music? Friends, it all comes together with this. Earth Day. Ha! Let me show you how I'm going to celebrate. Pine. It's well known pine is the granite of wood. Why aren't you wearing orange? I'm not a fat ninja. It's just me, Ezra. If that's the case, it's tasty, tasty murder.
Why is ours so special? Why is ours so special? Artists making music.
It's not tough to figure out who's a terrorist. The Random House Dictionary defines it as, quote, the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce, especially for political purposes. I think that's pretty succinct. So the murder spree committed by Anders Behring Breivik on Friday in Norway meets that test. He murdered 76 of his countrymen and published a 1,500-page madman's rant to explain his politics. He was insane, or evil, I think probably more evil than insane. His lawyer says so, and it's pretty obvious, but that doesn't mean it wasn't terrorism.
Well, that's hard to argue, so you know what? Point taken.
After reading his 1,500-page manifesto, I suspect that he talked to like-minded madmen, but actually did all the work himself.
Okay, I'm still with you.
Now, if Breivik turns out to have had a group of collaborators, though, they will surely be listed as a banned terrorist group around the world. Here's a look at the U.S. State Department's list of banned foreign terrorist groups. It's alphabetical: Abu Nidal, Abu Sayyaf, Al-Aqsa, Al-Shabaab, Ansar al-Islam. You know, you get the picture.
Okay, so where is all this going, do you ask? Well, this just happens to be the warm-up for what he actually wants to talk about, using a reasonable segue to cut into it.
Now, the Canadian list is pretty similar. Take a look at it. Abu Nidal, Abu Sayyaf, Al-Jihad, Al-Qaeda. There are a few differences between the Canadian and American lists. I mean, we have an extra Tamil terrorist group on our list that the U.S. doesn't. But let's recap for a moment. We know what a terrorist is. And if we're wondering if there's a terrorist group out there, we can check the list by our own government or by the U.S. government. Now, whether or not journalists choose to use the word terrorist is a very political matter, and it won't surprise you to learn that the most pro-terrorist networks in the world, like Britain's BBC and Canada's CBC, have explicit policies warning against using the word terrorist. Seriously.
Yeah, I wonder why. Could it be to keep assholes like you from just using the word on any one person or group that you might have a little grudge with? Could it be that? No. You're not that shallow, are you, Ezra?
The word terrorist itself can be a barrier rather than an aid to understanding. Our responsibility is to remain objective and report in ways that enable our audiences to make their own assessments about who is doing what to whom.
You wouldn't want us to make up our own minds. You would like to do that for us. Well, basically that's your purpose anyway, as a fucking pundit, is to tell other people what to think.
Calling a terrorist wouldn't be objective, you see. It would confuse things, you see, and would be a barrier to understanding.
Yeah, we heard you the first time. You don't need to repeat it.
And here's my favorite part of the BBC rules. Accepting that there are some actions which most people would recognize as a terrorist act, we should still avoid the word. Now, our pro-Taliban, pro-Omar Khadr, anti-Israel CBC here in Canada...
What makes you say that? What the fuck? How are they anti-Israel? What, like... You fucking just can't say that!
...is just the same. Here's a report from the CBC Ombudsman with almost identical language. It says CBC journalists should, quote, I'm going to quote now, exercise extreme caution before using the words terrorist and terrorism. It's a highly controversial term that can leave journalists taking sides in a conflict, unquote.
Okay, now saying that they're pro-terrorist is pretty much insinuating that they are terrorists. Not literally, of course, but that's the implication. And that's why journalists shouldn't be throwing the fucking word around.
No. When a terrorist commits terrorism and you don't call it terrorism, that's taking sides in a conflict. That's whitewashing terrorism. That's making excuses for terrorism. That's bending the language to pretend terrorism isn't so bad. That's being a PR agency for terrorism.
Alright, let's all remember that and see if it comes back to bite them in the ass.
It's amazing to me that the CBC and the BBC actually put their pro-terrorist rules in writing like that. They don't care. Which brings me to the exciting news of the day. Because the CBC has overcome their reluctance to call someone a terrorist, I'm quite excited about this. Now, I'm not talking about mass murderer Anders Breivik of Norway. They don't call him a terrorist. They have a much nastier name for him. They call him a Christian fundamentalist. They practically spit when they say that. Look at this CBC montage we put together. Take a look.
This is the prime suspect. He's a 32-year-old fundamentalist Christian.
Christian fundamentalist. They practically spit.
He's described as a 32-year-old fundamentalist Christian.
They practically spit.
A Christian fundamentalist.
They practically spit.
Already known as a fundamentalist Christian.
Spit.
He had some pretty Christian fundamentalist views.
Oh, they hate Christian fundamentalists much more than they hate terrorists, don't they?
Okay, Ezra, you gotta pick one. It's either they're pro-terrorists or they hate terrorists. Like, come on, Jesus Christ, this is the same broadcast. Pick one.
Of course, he wasn't Christian at all, as I proved yesterday. David hasn't been to church since he was a teenager. He's a pagan. I'm not talking about Breivik. The CBC has found someone else to call a terrorist. Check this out. It's a clip from the CBC on Friday. They name the real terrorist. Roll the clip.
You know, there are extremists in every religion, whether it's Islam, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Hinduism, even Buddhists. The Jewish Defense League is a banned terrorist organization in Canada. So
Did you hear that?
In one segment, we said the Jewish Defense League is a banned terrorist organization in Canada. The Jewish Defense League is not on the Government of Canada's list of groups or individuals identified as being associated with terrorism, and we very much regret the error.
So it's not just his opinion, it is a matter of fact. Let's look at that list again. Here's the Canadian list. The Jewish Defense League is not on the list. I have checked and double-checked.
Did they fuck up? Yes, they fucked up. You can tell by the way he was stammering that he obviously made a mistake when he said it. And Ezra, you should be a little bit more sympathetic, considering that you've had a few run-ins with liable cases yourself.
The CBC isn't shy about defaming a peaceful Jewish political club as terrorists. The Jewish Defense League is not a terrorist group. They're not even like the Guardian Angels, you know, that U.S. group that would ride on the New York subways in the 70s and 80s to protect people when the cops weren't around. They're not even like that. The Jewish Defense League is basically a group of bloggers and political commenters.
first time in 11 years that we have reformed and regrouped, and this is the biggest camp that we've ever had. What we're doing here in this Kahanachai Camp Mayor is we are training young Jews to defend themselves, to defend the Jewish community, to defend Jewish lives. As a result of the recent growth of anti-Semitism in the United States and throughout the world, there is an immediate need to train Jews to be professional fighters.
Here's a shot of their leader, Mayor Weinstein, commenting on Friday's mass murder. It's a videotape. Roll it for a second.
See what goes on in other countries in Europe, that there are acts of terrorism. There was an act of terrorism over the weekend from the other extreme. We don't want any extreme going on in Canada. We want to make sure that there won't be any foothold for terrorism.
That's the Jewish Defense League, a guy in a suit saying he's against terrorism. But Bill Gillespie of the CBC says he is a terrorist.
No, they actually said the GDL was, not him. It's just another example of how you love
bending the language
to make a point.
Weinstein seems pretty reasonable to me. He's not a terrorist. He's never been charged with terrorism, let alone convicted.
Well, there's always this.
Weinstein himself was once a member of a Jewish terrorist group. In 1994, he was identified in the Canadian Press article as a spokesperson for the Koch Party, also known as Kahana High. A Koch member in Israel had just massacred more than 50 Palestinian worshippers. Weinstein refused to condemn the attack. He doesn't deny making the statement, but he denies ever being a member of Koch.
I've never been a member of Koch or Kahana High.
Canada, the U.S., and the European Union later put Koch and Kahana High on their list of banned terrorist organizations.
Let alone listed as a terrorist group on the Canadian government's list of terrorists, or on the U.S. list, or anywhere else. It is made up. The CBC made it up. The CBC that is so reluctant to call Muslim terrorists because that would be taking sides, you see, loves to brand the mass murderer in Norway a Christian fundamentalist, and just announced on national TV a peaceful Jewish group as a group of terrorists. The CBC are slanderers. They're taking sides. They're not neutral. They work for the enemy.
Okay, who are you talking about? Voldemort? The Ice Queen? Ooh, I know, David Suzuki, right? Soren? Ooh, Richard Dawkins? Ah!
The CBC isn't shy about defaming a peaceful Jewish political club as terrorists. Courtesy of James Moore, Canada's Conservative Heritage Minister.
Alright, you get the gist of it now, so let's rewind it a bit back to what Ezra was saying earlier.
When a terrorist commits terrorism,
Weinstein himself was once a member of a Jewish terrorist group.
And you don't call it terrorism, that's taking sides in a conflict. The CBC isn't shy about defaming a peaceful Jewish political club as terrorists. That's whitewashing terrorism. That's making excuses for terrorism. The Jewish Defense League is basically a group of bloggers and political commenters that's bending the language to pretend terrorism isn't so bad. The Jewish Defense League is not a terrorist group. They're not even like the Guardian Angels. That's being a PR agency for terrorism.
Well, if that's true, Ezra, then what the hell does that make you? At the very best, it makes you a hypocrite.
The most pro-terrorist networks in the world, like Britain's BBC and Canada's CBC, have explicit policies warning against using the word terrorist. Seriously.
Well, since you employ the CBC's methods and you say the CBC are pro-terrorist, by extension, that must make you